Michael Knowles recently debated a leftist who's pro-abortion, so I'm going to call her an abortionist.
Yeah.
Someone in favour of abortion. And man, I like Michael Knowles, and I always love it when he gets to talk to a leftist. There's something about his demeanour and the way he speaks to them. He's very charitable and he's very polite, but there's something about the tone that underlies it that's just perfect.
Can I say thank you to Michael Knowles as well? Because as soon as you came back on Twitter, he did acknowledge you'd returned.
Yeah.
And you said, "Oh, I'm not quite a Catholic yet." And I said, "Yet, my subversion attempts are working." And Michael did like it, so we're working our magic.
He thinks I'll become a Catholic one day. What he doesn't realise is that I'm English, and so I'll never become a Catholic. Anyway, so Michael Knowles had a debate with a lady, a medical student. She's doing a PhD, I believe, called Bronte Remsick. And in this, I feel that a lot of the points that I was making in the Thicc Concepts podcast were totally validated. And I think this really brings out and highlights basically everything I was saying, is that some concepts have moral judgments and moral weight attached to them. And one of the things that leftists try to do are strip away these moral judgments by adopting thin concepts, such as, in fact, the example is Michael uses the term mother for a pregnant person, and she uses birthing person or pregnant person. You can see instantly the mother has deep attachment to it. Pregnant person, well, doesn't really mean anything. It's just very narrow, very thin concept.
This was the crux of his book Speechless as well, which Harry and I reviewed.
Yep.
And I have noticed one of the first forefronts of this linguistic evolution was feminists subjecting to the word spinster, probably because they resembled the remark too much.
Oh, yeah.
But the judgment that you are an unmarried woman late in life is inextricable from the word itself, because
Yes.
you can't have a married spinster,
Yep.
or in many respects, a happy spinster. So
Yep.
you had to get rid of those judgments. Instead, you were a strong, independent woman.
Yeah. So anyway, let's begin with a few clips. We've got a lot of clips to go through, but I think it'll be worth it. So let's begin with clip 1. What Bronte stands for.
We are not sitting here having a discussion about our personal disagreements. I am here to educate you and your viewers on the guidelines of proper medical practice that have been established by our country's leading medical experts, and they have stated publicly and unequivocally that abortion access is essential to comprehensive, evidence-based health care.
All right.
Right.
Evidence-based health. So the science.
There is nobody in a lab coat which can convince me that killing a baby is a good thing.
We're going to try not to get too preachy during this segment, but you can see where she stands. Her philosophical perspective is purely utilitarian, as we can see in clip 2.
A pregnant person gets to consent to continue with their pregnancy and must consent to the use of their body, because they are the one that understands their body and their life and their finances and everything that makes up the complexities of human life. They are the only ones who are able to decide and understand what is best for them with the guidance of, proper modern medical practices. Clean needle programs, they reduce disease transmission. And so even though someone is going to choose to do drugs, it is the responsibility of medical experts and healthcare providers to ensure that we cannot change someone's choices and behavioral patterns, but we can ensure that we provide them resources and able to ensure that their decisions and the impact of their decisions is minimized in whatever way that we can.
Right. So I spliced 2 clips together there just to make the point. So as you can see from the second clip where she's talking about California handing out clean needles to drug addicts, it's purely utilitarian. Completely consequentialist. There's no normative moral judgments here. It's all just, well, who can say? And then the first half was her talking about who knows best. And that's a very interesting and complex philosophical discussion, because she takes the utilitarian position is the person themselves knows their interest best. This is literally Bentham's dictum. You are the person who knows what's best for you. It's like, no, that's a very, very disagreeable philosophical statement. There are many, many, many other different philosophical views that take complete exception to that. And in fact, Bentham is kind of unique in thinking this. This is unique to utilitarianism, that actually what my interest is purely how I feel about something. This has been a long-running discussion since Aristotle up until this present day. Are there true or objective interests that a person has? And we covered this in the concept of representation that I did with Bo, actually, because the concept comes up. It's like, well, is a representative's job to just do what the represented want, or is it their job to serve what he considers to be their objective interests? Because, of course, if your constituency is one of majority heroin addicts, like any San Francisco politician, joking, they're going to be like, well, give us as much heroin as you can. And it might be your job as a representative there say, no, that's actually not good for you.
No, it's not compassionate to allow you to indulge in something which is killing you.
Exactly. And so all the way back to Aristotle, we have the concept of like true interests, as in what makes you a good and healthy, flourishing human being. And Bronte here doesn't accept that.
Well, I was going to say as well, it's interesting you splice those two together specifically because, and she later calls herself a leftist.
Yeah.
So we can assume that she buys into the conceptualization of capitalism as coercing people to work when they needn't not otherwise in order to earn a living, things like that. So let me just understand one thing, right? It is a coercive false consciousness to force someone to work to earn a living. However, it is not a false consciousness to be under the thrall of a drug addiction, and therefore you can consent to using drugs as much as possible, and your consent is not inhibited in any way by your dependency on that drug.
To suggest that there is no kind of coercion when it comes to heroin addiction, I think is absurd.
Yeah, and that's why, in many respects, consent is not a reliable foundation for moral legitimacy.
Yes. I mean, and yeah, no, that's, in fact, leads us nicely to part 3, where we talk about bodily autonomy and consent. Let's play this.
Clearly, I am restricting your bodily autonomy here, and that has been done throughout civilization, that remains on the books in the United States. So are you saying that drug laws are basically some sort of travesty?
No, of course not, because it's a matter of public health. Now, when we talk about pregnancy and abortion, essentially what causes pregnancy is sex, correct? And we cannot outlaw sex.
You say that we can't make sex illegal. I don't think anybody wants to make sex illegal. But historically, all sorts of sex has been illegal, and all sorts of sex remains illegal today.
Well, when you talk about things like, having sex with children or animals being illegal, that's because they can't properly consent to have sex.
That is not the only reason.
No.
That's one reason, but it's not the only reason. Again, as you can see, consent is literally the only metric that she can use.
Yes.
Which is not good because, of course, like someone who believes in some sort of metaphysic, kind of true objective, what C.S. Lewis might call the Tao, look out for our book club on the abolition of man soon, he would say that it is wrong in principle, even if you could show that an animal could consent or something like that. It would still be wrong.
As Cenk Uygur once tried to argue, and
Yes.
despite this, Anna Kasparian had the very conservative disgust sensitivity reflex
Good for her.
of, no, stop trying to justify a horse's ability to consent.
Exactly. And so you can see Anna situating herself within the tower of, no, there is actually an objective right and wrong here that is more than merely the ability to consent. Because, of course, that is impure and degenerate, and it is just gross. There's nothing wrong with saying that. But to her, if you could show that the horse consented, well, then she can't really, by her own very thin utilitarian morality, say that there was anything wrong there.
There's also the thing of, it's wrong for children to engage in sexual activity with adults because they cannot consent.
Yep.
Absolutely true. One, if you try to wiggle the boundaries of what constitutes a child or what constitutes maturity, as many on the left have tried to do, then you erode that standard of consent.
Yep.
And also, given the abortion issue, okay, children can also not express consent while they're in the womb to whether or not they'd like to be killed. So perhaps we should err on the side of caution until they can express that desire.
You would think there would be a strong argument from it is intrinsically wrong.
Yes.
Even though, questions of consent may arise. And consent, like you say, it's not the only exact standard because, as we've pointed out with the drug addict point, well, they will consent all day, every day to the drugs, but that doesn't make it good or right or that it reflects a kind of moral truth, which it obviously doesn't.
No.
So anyway, let's move on to language. This is what I find particularly interesting, how language is a form of emotional communication, which is true. And so it really makes you wonder why there are people on the other side of this argument. I mean, why wouldn't we want to communicate our emotional states and the moral feelings that we have? Why would we want to thin that out? And so language becomes a kind of inhuman tool. Because, of course, language created by humans, for the purpose of expressing human worldviews, well, there's nothing wrong with us using judgmental, morally loaded language. What's the purpose of removing the metaphysics attached to language and instead thinning out to be merely a description?
It's the primer to make you nihilistic enough to displace your values with theirs.
That's that's kind of the instrumentalization of it, but that's not necessarily the intent behind it, right? So the intent will. Well, let's watch this first.
But doesn't the question hinge on which language should we use? So one is dehumanizing, one is anthropomorphizing, in other words, humanizing. So then isn't the question that we have to answer, is this thing that we're talking about a human or not? And if it is a human, then we should only use the anthropomorphizing language. And if it is not a human, then we should only call him a clump of cells.
The embryo is human. That's not within question. It is a human embryo. It is
So
a
then why
human
wouldn't you
fetus.
use anthropomorphizing language? Why wouldn't you refer to it in human language?
Because language is often emotional, and pregnancy is an emotional state for someone to be in. And as a medical professional, you have to be conscious of the way that your words affect the patient.
And so you would lie to the patient? Because you've
It's
just
not
said,
lying.
Well, you said it is lying.
It depends on the mentality of the pregnant person and how they feel towards that pregnancy. Because as a medical professional in that exam room, you are trying to create a comfortable environment where that patient understands what their options are and what their situation is. And so when you are trying to identify how they feel about their current medical state, you want to use language that creates a comfortable environment for them.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is a mask-off moment to say that, and I do not agree with her, of course, that abortion is a purely medical procedure. But in order for my patient to have this medical procedure, they need to divorce themselves from the maternal affective attachment they have towards the baby, which would otherwise be marketed to them as an inconvenience. So she is implicitly admitting there, we need to revoke women's ability to give informed consent to this procedure, otherwise it won't really happen in the numbers that we would desire.
But it's also quite terrible, isn't it? It's like, okay, well, we have a concept called a baby that has it's a very thick concept. There's a lot attached to a baby. You know, you've got a lot of prescriptions on you. If you were walking down the street and you just saw a baby in a basket, you know you have to stop and do something about that. You can't just be like, well, that's not my baby, I don't care. No, there are loads of human attachments to the term baby and to you and to their mother and to their father and to there's just so much. It's probably the thickest concept that we have because there's so much that's important about the baby. And she's just like, well, if we're going to be asking the mother if we're going to kill the baby, well, then it's actually an easier sell. It helps the mother make a more morally neutral decision if we remove the concept and we call it a fetus instead, because, of course, the emotional attachments to the word fetus just don't exist.
Yeah, there's no innocence and vulnerability implied.
Exactly. There's no human character to it. It's a scientific word in a foreign language.
Even though Michael points out that fetus means baby in Latin.
Yeah, but it is a foreign
language.
And I like the way he's like, no, I'm using just plain, accurate Saxon words. It's just, no, it's a baby. What now? And because that contains the layers that she is specifically trying to shear off and say, well, look, this is an option to it. It's like, yeah, it might be an option, but should you take it? And of course, if you conceive of it like Michael Knowles conceived of it, of course not. You know, as a human being, you've got an obligation to protect babies. And she's like, yeah, but I'm trying to protect the mother, as if the mother is the moral equivalent of a baby, as if the mother is innocent and has made no wrong decisions and doesn't bear moral responsibility. A baby doesn't bear moral responsibility. It can't possibly. But the mother, an adult woman, of course, does. And for some reason, she wants to equalize these two things, which I just find remarkable. Centering the mother above all, it's like, okay, but why?
Because they do view it as a zero-sum game of trade-offs, very much like economics is. So you do have to take from one in order to ensure the other has their maximalized ability to express their liberty.
Well, she absolutely has to. Look, the mother's going to have to kill the baby. Someone's losing out here. But so let's play this next clip.
The word fetus allows this a pregnant mother in distress to abstract away the humanity of her child and makes it easier for that woman to justify having an abortion. Whereas if she were to call it a baby, it would be much, much harder for her to justify killing the baby in the womb through abortion, right? I think you would acknowledge that.
Yeah, I can acknowledge that calling it a baby minimizes the options that the pregnant person feels like they have, and it can put unwanted pressure onto them. And if they are not in a financial, mental, or physical state to carry through with that pregnancy appropriately, calling it a baby makes them feel as if they have less options than they truly do and should have.
Calling it sacrificial chattel makes it much easier than calling it a child to tear out its heart to ensure that Quetzalcoatl doesn't send the storm to destroy our village.
If we call Jews people, it makes them harder to put them in the death camps.
Yeah.
Like that is just awful. Like she's like Knowles does a great job in this whole thing of just clearly laying out the points, and she's just like, yeah. It's like, but no, that's evil. You're literally dehumanizing a baby in order to be able to kill it.
I guarantee, we haven't been through her Twitter or anything, I guarantee she has some posts about Donald Trump's dehumanizing language of people at the border leading to genocide.
Maybe, I don't know whether she uses Twitter or not. I couldn't actually find her, so I assume she doesn't. But that is just remarkable. The mask off, just like, yeah, if we use humanizing language on a human, then people treat them with moral consideration. But if we dehumanize the people, then we can actually just murder them and no one will care. So yeah, that was exactly the lesson of Hannah Arendt from the Holocaust. That was exactly the lesson. So why are we just being like, yeah, well, it's a fetus actually. But then she moves on from this to address Michael Knowles's, quote, moral superiority. Play this clip.
Michael, do you know what the leading cause of death for pregnant people is?
Pregnant people? Mothers? Women?
If you'd like to call them mothers, not all of them are mothers, but if you'd like to call them that.
What are they if they're not mothers?
They're pregnant people.
What people other than mothers are pregnant?
Does it bother you to use inclusive language?
Well,
It's just interesting.
I prefer to use precise language.
It's interesting because you come into this conversation, trying to hold this moral superiority, but then
I try to be moral when I can, but
Right, but when I use inclusive language, which it only takes a couple extra syllables to use inclusive language,
To include
and
who?
it seems to include people who don't, identify as women but can become pregnant.
So before we look at that, I love Knowles's responses. Pregnant people, like the whole thing could have been scripted, right? But obviously wasn't, and he played it brilliantly. But when she says you come in here with a moral superiority, and it's merely him using morally loaded language. He hasn't said I'm better than you. He hasn't been disrespectful to her. He hasn't insulted her or anything like that. He's just said, well, look, I actually think the moral prescriptions that we hold as human beings, humanizing babies, for example, is a good thing and we should do it. And she's like, well, you're just being morally superior. It's like, no, you're deliberately making yourself morally inferior by using language that strips away moral judgment. And then she's like, how dare you make yourself morally superior? It's like, well, sorry, like I can't help that you are the one who's debasing yourself morally by trying to dehumanize babies to make it okay for the mother to abort them.
Notice as well how he immediately went for mothers and not women. Because one of his primary critiques of his colleagues, Matt Walsh's What is a Woman documentary, is that it ends with the biological classification. Now, that makes sense for the documentary, which is examining transactivism and walking away from the objective definition.
Yeah.
But he did say it's a sanitizing, scientific, and he did just recently call all science fake, which I agree with, definition that means that there is no expectation laden within womanhood. There is no aesthetic expectation, which men quite enjoy, and then equally men should have aesthetic expectations.
Women enjoy too.
Exactly.
Like this is a way that women express power.
Why else would the makeup industry exist?
Exactly.
And so the fact that he immediately deflects to that, he is saying he is using precise language, yes, but I think you're right. And
Wrong
it goes
term,
a step.
rich language. That's what he was using.
Yeah.
Thick language.
He goes more than just the precise, because the precise would be the biological. The thick language is the fact that he used the term mother, which I like. And then she immediately goes, well, why aren't you being inclusive? Because if you include an antonym in the definition, you destroy the use of language in and of itself. So it's utterly pointless, and you don't get to stand on a moral soapbox about that.
Exactly. But then she's resentful that he's adopting a position of morality. It's like the moral superiority isn't that he's saying I'm better than you, it's that he is prepared to take a moral position
Yes.
where she's deliberately abnegating that ground and saying, how dare you stand on that high ground?
But there's also the implicit arrogance of the managerialism of her position is she's trying to say, I'm above morality. I'm the enlightened centrist in this position, even though she's a radical. And she comes in and says, but instead I'm just going to explain to you what the science is and why you have to follow it, otherwise you're a denier. So she sets herself up as someone who can read morality outwards to us as if there is no moral debate and merely there is just a correct position.
Yeah.
And then gets indignant when he opposes a parallel moral system. And so you are engaging in moral conversations.
Yeah.
You just don't
She
have
just
this
doesn't
wherewithal
recognise it.
to think of it. Yeah.
Because she's purely utilitarian. But let's see how her view on morality actually is inconsistent. Let's watch this next one.
I need to accept the idea that a man, someone who is born a man and looks like a man, can really become a woman. That's a prerequisite of my being a moral person.
I mean, yes. To me, it is, because if you are trying to deny someone of their identity and deny what their life experience is, then that doesn't seem like a moral stance to me.
I would like to identify, I do identify actually, as the correct person on this issue of abortion. I identify as being correct and more correct than you on this issue. And I would just ask that you accept and affirm my identity. Do you?
Well, you are not a medical professional, and abortion and pregnancy
No, I'm
is
just
a
talking about my
medical
identity.
concern. That's not your identity.
That is my, I promise you, that's my identity.
I'm saying that you are someone without medical training, and pregnancy is a medical condition and abortion is a medical procedure. And so we need to abide by the informed and knowledgeable opinions of medical experts.
Right. This is brilliant, right? Because she begins being like, no, to be moral, you have to accept that person's subjective identity. Doesn't matter if, and my other points, Knowles is like, well, I can see that they're a woman or a man or whatever, right? And she's like, no, you've got to accept it or else you're not being moral. And as soon as like, okay, I identify it as correct, she's like, well, you're not correct. And the medical science, the objective reality, the observations that the scientists have made and catalogued in their documentation, and in all of this academic literature show that you're incorrect, and therefore I don't have to accept it. So there we go. This is the contradiction in your own moral framing. You know, at once you say you have to subjectively accept the identity, and the other time it can be that someone outside of it can objectively tell you you're wrong.
Yeah, she's just playing sleight of hand to the moral authority to which she wants to appeal.
I don't think that, I mean, at one point in the conversation, she's like, well, no, I don't have philosophical training. So I don't think she's doing it on purpose. I think she's actually been kind of brainwashed into this. And so it slips between whether she understands or not. But then it starts drilling down to, okay, well, where do your rights come from? Because this all really hinges on the question of rights. So let's watch this next one. If it works. Maybe.
The government protects our rights, so where do those rights come from?
But I mean, our rights don't necessarily come from anywhere aside from our own analysis of our human experience.
Oh, so then we don't really have any rights at all.
The rights that we have decided on based on the analysis of our human experience, we have decided that these are the rights that prioritize the health and well-being of society, and these are the things that we need to protect in order to prioritize the health and well-being of society.
So you're saying that my rights are just whatever I say my rights are?
No, our rights are what our society has decided on a large spectrum.
So the rights of whatever the general will decrees
Yes.
is in your best interest.
Yes,
So
very
she's using
much.
the word right interchangeably with individual pieces of legislation, essentially.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is very much to Michael Knowles. He believes in human rights, right? Things that are intrinsic to humans. She believes in civil rights.
Yes.
And she has adopted the Rousseauian perspective that you essentially give up all of your human rights in exchange for civil rights. And so the rights that you have in society or whatever the government says, and this is why she can say that healthcare is a right, abortion is a right, blah, 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 blah. All these nonsense things that aren't rights can be rights. Michael Knowles, of course, being the traditional American in the room, adopts the American perspective that the rights are inherent by God, and you give up a portion of these inherent rights in order to protect the rest. The right to say, damage other people or their property or anything like this. But you've got, the intrinsic rights that you have that are protected by the state. And so, okay, fine. Bronte has revealed herself throughout this entire conversation to be a pure materialist. Her entire worldview is flattened down to the physical realm. That's all that exists. Rights are merely what we grant ourselves by the force of our arms. This is a one-dimensional utilitarian worldview.
And assumedly, nature would be violating your human rights if the internet went out or healthcare just didn't materialize because you couldn't manufacture the drugs.
If the Cuban doctors go on strike, then it is the Cuban doctors who are wrong for denying their patients their human rights.
Well, the fact that gender hormones do not grow on trees in the wilderness means that nature is a revolutionary enemy.
So let's talk about how Bronte found God. Let's watch this next clip.
And so that is the topic at hand, is it not? Is it not discussing people who exist in a body that they don't feel comfortable in? And modern medicine has the ability to help them address that issue.
Bronte, when you say exist in a body, or you say they find themselves in a body, who do you think they are? What does that mean, exist in a body?
Our fellow citizens that we share this society with.
But who is, you're saying that they are distinct from their body.
Yes.
So you are not your body?
No.
What are you?
I believe that I'm a soul with a body.
But you are the soul, and your body is just...
it's the physical manifestation.
Your body's a costume. Oh, the body is the physical manifestation. That's different. Well, I agree with that. I think that the body is a symbol of the soul. I think that the soul is a substantial form of the body. We agree on that.
She's a Catholic.
Well, no.
Of course she's not really a Catholic, but my point is, we are not talking about science.
No.
We are not talking about anything. I don't want to hear about your medical consensus. I don't want to hear about what's best for the mother. You have a religious worldview.
Yes.
Right? The materialist perspective, she was to be consistent in her position to say, my body, my brain and my mind, my what she calls a soul, my consciousness is a product of my brain, which did not precede my body. It wasn't floating around the ether somewhere and then chose this body and then, oh no, I'm in the wrong body. Nonsense, right? But she instead has a totally concealed metaphysics. We are not having a discussion about the science or what's economically beneficial or what is practically beneficial. We are talking about theology, and we have been talking about theology the whole time. It just took, and this was right at the end of the conversation. It took Michael 2 hours to get through this, to get to the point where she's like, well, yeah, but my soul is separate to my body. It's like, what soul?
It's not like it's an appeal to what the DSM-5 do or like Sam Harris's psychological well-being, wellness metric, or where you would say that my psychology is disrupted by my gender dysphoria, and so I need to bring my body in line with how I feel inside.
Yep.
Instead, it's actually attributing a malevolent will to the sorting mechanism, which takes your soul from the ether and puts it in the wrong body. So either God is entirely incompetent, or it's the Gnostic belief that a malevolent God created the world, and we are struggling existentially against the natural order that this demonic being has instantiated.
That is exactly why I described this as Gnosticism on Twitter.
So trans activists are liberation theologists.
They're literal Gnostic mystics.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I'm glad that, like, I love mask-off moments like that. It's like, well, my soul, who's you? My soul. What do you mean? You know, you're making a bunch of theological commitments here to which your fellow utilitarians probably don't agree, right? And I, an atheist, I'm in no way bound to agree with. And so you have just betrayed your entire worldview.
And I, a Catholic, find you blasphemous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is now actually a pertinent conversation for you to have with Michael, because he is also a Catholic and you're blaspheming in front of him.
Yep.
Based on theological reasoning,
Mea
right?
culpa, mea culpa.
Now, I realize this has gone on, but this was just so good to me, right? So there was a small thing here that when you're in the middle of a debate and you've got a lot to juggle, right? It's often only afterwards you realize, oh, I should have picked that up.
Yeah.
And so I don't blame Michael for not picking this up. But okay, soul, wrong body. Who else has a soul? The baby.
Yes.
Why don't we talk about that, Bronte? Like, what? Okay, the soul of the mother is feeling trapped by having a child. But what about the soul of the baby who's now being killed?
And you also don't know if that baby has been implanted into the wrong body until it comes out as well. So could abortion not be a form of transgenocide?
I mean, it's mad, actually. But anyway, let's just watch this final clip just to top this all off.
Say, I have a body is an incoherent statement, according to what you've just agreed to. Because you would say, I am a body, and I am a soul, and I'm this, the technical term for it is hylomorphic being, that is body and soul inextricably linked on this earth.
Right, but that doesn't mean that my mentality and my soul is accurately represented by the body that I present to the world.
We're not having a conversation about medical science anymore. We're having a conversation about theology. Like, Michael can even introduce complex, like, Catholic terminology, you know, like, to explain the concept she's trying to put across.
Yeah.
That she has no idea about.
I do love how she started off by saying, I'm going to explain the medical science to you. And then I'm waiting for her to pull out her chart as to tap where on the anatomical diagram.
Where's the soul located, Bronte? It is madness. Sorry, I realized that was a long segment, but like, I just couldn't pass it up. I couldn't pass it up. But that's the point, isn't it? Like, that underlies almost all of this is a form of theology. And congratulations to Michael Knowles for really drawing that out in the most entertaining way.
I hope you enjoyed that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, and I hope you're all having a very jolly time right now. If you'd like to find more from us, you can go to our website, lotuseaters.com, and subscribe to gain access to all of our premium content. We do also have some freemium content available at the moment, including this, the UK's left-wing literature curriculum, where Connor and Bo take a look at what's going on with the left-wing curriculum in English classes all across the UK. And if you'd like to know more about what Bo gets up to, you can follow him at Getter at BoDade. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again soon.